Hi, welcome. Today we are breaking down the psychology of Walter White, a character from Breaking Bad. If you don't know me, I'm Anna, a clinical psychology doctoral candidate. Welcome to this channel. We are back in the closet today because I didn't want any distractions for this video. I know based on my outline, it's going to be quite a long video, and so yeah, it's going to be a little bit of a more bland background today, but I hope that's okay because what I have to say will be interesting. So this is really examining the question, based on the behaviors I saw in the show, what would Walter White's mental diagnosis be? What are the different traits and symptoms that support that diagnosis? And more importantly, why is his character such a lesson to all of us? What can this teach us about dealing with narcissists in our life? Since Breaking Bad is a pretty R-rated show and YouTube likes to demonetize certain words, I will be using some code words. So when I mean this, I will say clip, and when I mean this, I will say crystal. This is kind of similar to my video on the psychology of The Sopranos in that way. I had to use a lot of code words for that. And that's also interesting because Tony Soprano's character is said to have kind of paved the way for Walter White, but Tony was a loved anti-hero, whereas Walter White is more of a hated anti-hero. Okay, so let's get into it. In my opinion, as a therapist, Walter White has narcissistic personality disorder. He also almost meets the criteria for antisocial personality disorder, but I think narcissism better encapsulates what the reasoning is behind his behavior. Narcissism, as you may or may not know, is the most misunderstood diagnosis on the internet these days. I do not mean it in like the, oh, my ex is a narcissist way. I mean it in the, he actually would meet the criteria for narcissistic personality disorder way. And it's interesting because this was my second time watching Breaking Bad, and the first time that I watched it, I didn't have any psychological education. And before I started rewatching it, I was pretty certain, based on what I remembered about the show, that Walt was going to meet the criteria for NPD. I started rewatching the show, and the first episode starts with life not going so great for him. He gets narcissistic injury after narcissistic injury, basically like a blow to his ego. He feels humiliated when he has to clean the car of a student who hates him, who he hates back. That student also publicly deserts his class. His brother-in-law Hank suggests that he's not a real man and that he has no excitement in his life. So yeah, things are not going great. He's kind of easily humiliated and narcissistically injured. And then he also gets the news that he has cancer, and Walt takes that news with a lot of emotional numbness and kind of hyperfixating on a stain on the doctor's white coat instead of addressing how he feels about the news. And we see that the cancer news makes Walt much more raw and susceptible to narcissistic injuries. So he flips out on his boss at the car wash, Bogdan. Yes, Bogdan is Romanian, and it's not pronounced Bogdan like they do it in the show, it's Bogdan. Anyway, I digress. So at this point in the first season, I found myself feeling empathy for Walt, and I almost kind of chastised myself. I felt guilty for remembering that he was a narcissist just because he's prone to feeling humiliated by other people. After all, who wouldn't be a little bit sensitive when they're an underpaid high school chemistry teacher who just found out they have cancer, can't afford to pay for treatment, even though they hold 2 jobs, and is trying to support their family? Like, in my head, I was like, oh my god, like that doesn't make someone a narcissist. But as the show progresses, it gets harder and harder to have empathy for Walt. It becomes clear that he very much does meet the criteria for NPD. And so then the question kind of becomes, can someone develop a personality disorder in middle age? Like, can that happen, that someone just has a personality disorder that develops later into adulthood? And the answer to this is no. Personality is pretty stable by the time we reach adulthood, by the time we reach young adulthood even, and personality disorders don't just develop out of nowhere. If something might look like a personality disorder that's developing later in age, if it's brought on by, say, like a substance use issue or a major trauma that occurred, but that wouldn't really be considered a personality disorder. In the beginning of the show, Walt's narcissism is just lying dormant. He's more of a vulnerable, covert narcissist. His narcissistic traits are pretty internal in the beginning, and they haven't really started to affect those around him yet. He's very fragile, and he hasn't yet developed that malignant, grandiose flavor to it. Walt is a great example of how many narcissists have both a malignant and a vulnerable side to them, both a covert and a grandiose side to them. Depending on how things are going for them in life, one might get activated while the other lies dormant, and it's not unusual to kind of switch between the two. And the thing is, Walt's tendencies were always hidden underneath the surface. Had the people in his life been paying attention, they would have seen the red flags, that the traits were always there. This has interesting implications for us personally. We have the power to recognize when someone around us shows dangerous traits lying dormant, and we have the ability to remove ourselves before those traits get activated and start to harm us. So often we feel so shocked when we feel like someone suddenly changed and suddenly they're a different person and they're causing harm to us. But how could we be so blind to what was right in front of our eyes? Empathy is the reason why, because it causes us to justify and rationalize people's behavior. Just like I started to empathize with Walt's character at the very beginning of the show. I thought, no, I'm being too harsh on him. Who wouldn't feel angry and humiliated when they're being unfairly treated by both life and those around them? Who wouldn't feel like a victim when that is their life? So you see, it's really our own justifications that stop us from realizing the danger that lies dormant in people who've already shown us a little flavor of their true colors. So in case you don't know, what are the criteria for NPD? A pervasive pattern of grandiosity, need for admiration, lack of empathy, beginning by early adulthood and present in a variety of different contexts, as evidenced by 5 or more of the following symptoms: grandiose sense of self-importance, preoccupation with fantasies of unlimited success, power, brilliance, beauty, and ideal love, belief that he or she is special and unique and can only be understood by or should associate with other special or high-status circles, requires excessive admiration, entitlement, interpersonally exploitative, lack of empathy, either envious of others or believes that other people are envious of them, and arrogant, haughty behaviors or attitudes. So I'm going to go through the following as quickly as possible. I'm just going to go through each of the symptoms that were very glaring in Walt and outline some evidence for when he behaved in those ways. If this is something that you're not really interested in, you don't want to see the whole thing of why Walt is a narcissist or all the different behaviors that he had, you can feel free to jump to the next timestamp. If you want to more so just learn about how to apply this case study to your life, but context could also be important, so I do hope you stay. So let's start with the interpersonal exploitativeness. From the start, from like one of the first few episodes, he blackmails Jesse Pinkman into going into business with him and seems to have no qualms about extortion or seeing his former student dealing crystal. So kind of ties in with the lack of empathy there. It's interesting because he completely lacks charisma and warmth. He's not a friendly guy whatsoever. He's very condescending and no fun to be around, but he's also very manipulative and he uses that to exploit others. It shows that you don't always have to be superficially charming to manipulate others successfully. Some people can very successfully manipulate others while being a nightmare. He's perhaps the most exploitative with Jesse. He can be an okay father figure with his biological children because that's more convenient to him and it serves his image as this doting father. But how you treat the people that don't bring you clout is who you really are. And in Walt's case, he's horribly abusive to Jesse and completely ruins his life by consistently manipulating him. He's deceptive. He gets really good at lying on the spot. He's conniving and calculated, but also impulsive and pathological in the ways in which he lies. It becomes such a habit to him that it's kind of like second nature. He doesn't even realize when it doesn't benefit him to lie anymore. He always blames everything on Jesse. He never takes responsibility for his own mistakes or his own role in things going wrong. He gets really impulsive, explosive, and aggressive after Skylar kicks him out. This is the first narcissistic collapse that we see where he flies off the rails and his true colors become very real. Jesse's speech in the hospital when Walt is trying to hoover him with $1.5 million is very telling. Ever since Jesse has met Walt, he's lost everyone. He's alone. His self-esteem has been ruined. Walt's made him feel inferior and good for nothing. This is what happens when someone corrodes you through chronic exploitation, like deception, manipulation, isolation, criticism, and so forth. Now, Mike sees right through him, and he calls him a ticking time bomb. There are certain people who can see through the manipulation, and those people usually get scapegoated by the narcissist. We see Walt also trying to coerce and manipulate Jesse into staying in the business. He tries flattery first, then shaming, then brings down his self-esteem, interspersed with a lot of feigned empathy for him, followed by feigned indignation, anger, rationalization of his poor behavior, then guilting, threatening not to pay him when he realizes it's still not working to manipulate him. This was a really interesting scene. I recognized this pattern. I knew the sequence that was about to happen before he actually went down it, because it's literally such textbook manipulation. Let's say that your narcissistic mom wants you to go on vacation with her. She might start with, "I enjoy spending time with you so much. Won't you come? It'll be fun. We'll play games and eat good food and drink champagne." And then when she sees that you're resistant, it might turn to, "What do you mean you don't care about these things? Since when? You're always off eating expensive foods without me. You're reckless with money. I thought this was what you liked." And then it might go into, "I care for you. That's why it means so much to me that you come with me on this trip." And when that doesn't work, it might switch to, "How dare you? After all I spent on you when you were growing up, how could you turn your back on me? I'm your mother. I do not deserve this treatment." And then ultimately, "You know what? I'm not paying for your tuition anymore. You hear me?" And the way to stand up to someone like this is kind of like Jesse does. Walk away. Call their bluff. Let them follow through on their threats if that's the path they want to go down on. Don't give in to them. Don't give in to what they want, no matter how much flattery or emotional blackmail or criticism or shaming they resort to. Let them knock themselves out. Because the worst thing that you can do in that situation is to cave into someone who's trying to manipulate you, because then they hold power over you, and then they've learned that this works. And if they do it again in the future, you're also going to cave. But back to the ways that Walt is interpersonally exploitative. For a while there, Skylar is practically his hostage. He never physically hurts her from what I can remember, but he psychologically traps and destroys her. Also, that video where he's trying to incriminate Hank, very cunning and calculating. It helps him excel at chemistry and helps him get out of tight situations, but it can also be used to hurt other people to be so calculating. He also easily feigns emotions. He tries to manipulate Jesse until the very last minute, and finally Jesse sees through it and calls him out. He tells Jesse about Jane because he knows it's the most painful thing that he can do to him. And I think the last interaction with Jesse is really important. So we see Jesse's pointing I don't want to say the word, he's pointing at one of these things at Walt, and Walt says, "Do it, you want this." And Jesse wants him to cut the manipulation for once and just admit that it's Walt who wants this. And Walt finally does. For the very first time in his life, he stops trying to manipulate Jesse, so Jesse can finally then say to him, "If you want this, then you do it." So that's how to stand up to a manipulator. You call it out that it's not you who wants to do something. It's their own selfish interest that they're trying to talk you into. Then, once they admit that it's what they want, you tell them to do it themselves, because you're not there to manifest their selfish interests. So that was all one symptom, interpersonal exploitativeness, and now moving on to lack of empathy. Narcissists don't completely lack empathy like an antisocial personality disorder, also called psychopathy, but it's very touch and go. It can be confusing for people because many people expect narcissists to not have any empathy whatsoever. So when they do see a narcissist showcase empathy on a rare occasion, they use that to justify why this person is not a narcissist. Walt does initially have some empathy, not more than the average person. Actually, I would say less than the average person, even in the beginning. But he does feel remorse about having to clip Crazy 8. And like I said, not more than you would expect the average person to, not more than Jesse does, for instance. Jesse has a lot of empathy. And it becomes apparent throughout the show that Walt does care for Jesse in his own way, and he does care for his family. It's just that doesn't stop him from hurting other people. That's the thing though. The issue is not that people like him don't care for others. Of course they do. They're only human. The issue is that they still hurt the people that they care about immensely. It doesn't really matter whether or not they care about someone, because that person is still at risk of being seriously harmed. He's also very selfish. After Jesse tells him that they lost the money and that he got arrested, Walt only cares about whether the police mentioned his name. He doesn't seem to care at all that Jesse's in the hospital. We see a lack of empathy for Jesse when he's being kicked out of his house. He wants nothing to do with him. He won't help him. No empathy for the high school kid that he fails. By season 2, the empathy that Walt showed for Crazy 8 is pretty much completely gone. He's become desensitized to violence and is able to justify it pretty easily. He has no remorse or empathy for Jesse's friend Combo, who got clipped because Walt insisted on expanding their territory. He doesn't care at all when Jesse is completely out of it on H. He's just desperate for the product so that he can make a deal with Gus. He lets Jane asphyxiate right in front of his own eyes when he has the ability to save her. And yes, technically it's for Jesse's well-being, but it's still insanely callous, and no one has the right to decide that another person doesn't deserve to live. It's treating someone's life like a pawn in a game of chess. And then it's interesting because Jane disappearing leads to her dad accidentally causing a plane crash at his job. And it's kind of the butterfly effect. A seemingly small action on Walt's part causes a series of events that lead to immense consequences. He has no empathy whatsoever. He gives a callous speech at the high school, invalidating the students' pain about the plane crash, focusing only on the history and the numbers without caring at all about the human suffering, even though it's partly his fault that it happened indirectly. It kind of sounds at that point like he's trying to justify it for his own conscience, but his sense of responsibility is buried so deep inside him that he won't even acknowledge to himself that what happened was his fault. He does show a tiny bit of remorse when he's in delirium because Jesse put sleeping pills in his coffee and he apologizes for Jane, but Jesse doesn't realize what he's apologizing for. He has no sense of recognition that he's supplying crystal to a bunch of people whose lives will be exponentially worse because of it. He feels none of the remorse that Jesse does for clipping Gail, who was a perfectly innocent and nice man. He shows a complete lack of regard for the well-being of others. He gets the Honduran women at the laundry place to clean the lab, and they consequently get sent back to Honduras. Of course they do. He would have realized that would inevitably happen if he had thought about it, but he has no regard for how his actions could affect others. He poisons Brock just to turn Jesse against Gus. He feels no empathy whatsoever for Gus either once Gus crosses him. He doesn't seem to care too much about the kid on the bike that Todd clips. Jesse hears him cheerfully humming after the incident as if he doesn't even care. He hires hitmen to clip 9 men in prison just to cover his own ass. He has completely decomposed morally by that stage. Just completely no remorse, just revenge and self-serving clipping. But at the end, he does still have some empathy. He would give up $80 million to keep Hank alive. He saves Jesse in the end. His empathy never completely dissipates. Now, about the symptom of arrogance, he's so condescending to Jesse. He thinks that he's better than him because he's smarter and more educated. He talks big with Tuco because he thinks he's superior to him for being educated again. This is the first time we really see him getting a power trip by standing up to a tough guy in the crystal business. He becomes so incredibly full of himself and arrogant. Like when he says, "Say my name," the power goes to his head so much. Mike calling him out on his arrogance is ultimately what gets him clipped. Because Mike, the last thing that he says to him is, "You with your pride and with your ego." Those are the last words he says before Walt flies into a rage. If someone can see right through him and see his true colors, that person cannot be allowed to exist because of the shame that they instill in that person. In terms of entitlement, he gets really entitled to not getting a citation by the police officer for driving with a cracked windshield, even though technically him not saving Jane is what caused the plane crash, which is what caused his cracked windshield. In the script that Skylar makes for their fake gambling story, he can't wrap his head around why he's supposed to feel ashamed for what he's done. He thinks the ends justify the means and completely exonerates himself of blame. As for grandiosity, he is completely driven by ego. He's mad that Jesse cooks without him, even though Jesse invited him and gave him half of his money anyway. Walt thinks he's God's gift to the world. When he says, "I am the danger," he really overestimates his importance after Gus is gone. He thinks he's like a tough guy when there are actually much more powerful key players in the game. He's very greedy with money, would rather clip 2 innocent people than lose money or just make less of it. It's related to grandeur because he likely has fantasies about being extraordinarily rich and being this manly man provider. He assumes that Skylar will go really big for his 51st birthday, even though she literally hates him at that point, and he seems disappointed with what she's planned, which is cooking dinner, inviting Hank and Marie. And like I said, she's really unhappy with him at that point in life, and she's still doing this. When he's on the run from the police and he sees Gretchen and her husband saying that Walt's only contribution to gray matters technology is half of the name, that the man they knew was gone, that hurts him immensely. To tell someone like Walt that he's not as important as he thinks he is is the worst thing you can do to them. And he's also envious of others. He's envious of Gretchen because she's rich. From the very beginning, he views her as playing innocent, when in reality, Gretchen just genuinely seems like a nice person who covers for him and offers to pay for his cancer treatment. And yeah, maybe she doesn't deserve all the money that she has, and she does seem a little bit spoiled, but still, she seems like a kind person at her core. And it's true, he should feel a little bit envious because he did contribute to the reason why she and her husband are rich. But this could just be another way to justify his behavior. Is the level of envy proportionate to the cause of the envy? Is envy very common in this person's life? Because if it's very common and it's very often out of proportion, then it could be related to narcissism. Envy for narcissists is related to entitlement. They believe they are entitled to grandeur, so when other people get good things and they don't, it activates their envy. He also can't let Hank call Gail a genius, so he has to give away that Gail copied the work of someone else, even though it puts him at risk to tell Hank that. He just can't handle the envy he feels when someone else gets viewed in a grand manner. He wants to be the only and most supreme, grandiose person. So he definitely meets the criteria for at least 6 of the symptoms of NPD. He absolutely has NPD in my personal opinion. But like I said, he does have some psychopathic tendencies as well. We see a lot of impulsivity and reckless risk-taking, sometimes just to see what he can get away with, like telling Hank, yeah, I have $500,000 of cash in the suitcase. Or when Skylar kicks him out and he starts speeding down the road and closes his eyes, almost running into a truck. Or when he blows up an expensive car for no reason, just because he can. We definitely also see a failure to conform to social norms with respect to lawful behaviors. Like, yeah, I'd say that's the majority of what the show is. Deceitfulness. I had put this under exploitativeness for the NPD criteria, but it could also be framed as antisocial personality disorder. Because yeah, he lies a lot, he lies pathologically, and he's really good at it. Impulsivity and failure to plan ahead, arguably so. He hasn't really thought out the long-term repercussions of his crystal business, and he often does act impulsively. Irritability and aggressiveness. Oh yeah, he clips quite a few people, and sometimes that's due to his own reactive aggression. He displays reckless disregard for the safety of self and others. Brock, case in point. Consistent irresponsibility. Yes, he does fail to uphold his responsibilities as a teacher, and when working with Bogdan, he leads his family into financial ruin, all because of his irresponsibility. And lack of remorse? Yeah, I would say so. So he meets 7 out of 7 of the criteria for antisocial personality disorder. But the thing is, in order to be diagnosed with ASPD, you have to have evidence of a conduct disorder before age 15. So technically, he wouldn't be able to meet the criteria for a diagnosis. And also, the diagnosis of ASPD is very behavioral. NPD can tell us more about why he does the things that he does, which in my opinion is all for grandeur. Why is he like this? We don't know. All we really know about his childhood and his upbringing is that his dad died at age 6 of Huntington's disease. So we see an early trauma, an early attachment rupture. That can definitely contribute to the development of narcissism, but I wish we knew a little bit more about his upbringing. So moving on into the juicy stuff, like diving a little bit deeper than just his diagnosis, and also how we can apply this to our own lives. I think Walt is an example of what happens when your shadow self takes over. Walt's shadow self is his grandiose narcissistic self. Now, if you don't know what a shadow self is, it's a Jungian concept about how we all have a side of ourselves that was pushed to the unconscious that sometimes kicks in, and those were all the traits that were kind of discouraged for us to take on. When we meet Walt, he seems like an average guy. He's kind of an uncharismatic jerk as a teacher. He's an all-right dad. He's a guy who feels fragile because his life is relatively boring. But once he's hit with the cancer news, his shadow self comes out of the woodwork. His shadow self happens to be someone very callous, exploitative, deceptive, grandiose, arrogant, entitled, aggressive. We consistently see it come out the worse life is going for him. On his 50th birthday is, I think, the first time that we see it because he's having some sort of midlife crisis combined with the cancer news. And that's when he gets in a fight with Hank. and he makes Walt Jr. get drunk for no reason until he throws up in the pool. We also see his shadow self really coming out and taking over when Skylar kicks him out and when he's discovered as being Heisenberg. In fact, we can even go as far as to say that Heisenberg is Walt's shadow self. For the majority of Breaking Bad, Heisenberg, his shadow self, overtakes him. It's the reason why Gretchen refers to not knowing the man she knew as Walt. It's why the day after his 50th birthday, Walt says, "I'm not sure who that was," about his behavior the night before. There's a part of him that has been lying dormant that even he himself doesn't recognize as a part of him. This is why shadow selves have to be healthily integrated into one's identity, not to run rampant and wreak havoc on a person's life. This compartmentalization isn't healthy, like when he goes from being violent Heisenberg one moment to playing with his baby like a great dad the next. This compartmentalization of the parts that make up our identities can be very dangerous because if they're very isolated, one or the other can take over, and that can lead to very extreme behavior. And we also see him reaching narcissistic collapse, his rock bottom. That's at the very end when he has this moment of insight, saving Jesse, admitting his own narcissism to Skylar. At the end of the show, Walt has narcissistic collapse because his visions of grandeur are completely disintegrated. He's on the run, he's hated by his family, he's wanted by the police, he's publicly shamed by those who used to be his friends, he has no use for his money. He has reached rock bottom. Walt is a highly intelligent man. It is this rock bottom that allows him to finally introspect and realize that it was his own actions that led him there. If he had even one string to pull on, something to get him out of the situation, he wouldn't realize it. But because he has nothing, he has no other option but to look inward and to try to change. He needed to reach rock bottom to finally realize it. He finally gains insight into the fact that he never went into the crystal business to provide for his family. He was doing it for himself. He even says it to Skylar in their very last interaction. He says, "I did it for me. I liked it. I was good at it. And I was alive." It's true. It was never about his family. It was about his ego. It was not that he wanted to make sure his family was financially secure before the cancer took him, or maybe that was a tiny bit of it in the very beginning. It was that he wanted to look like a man that financially secures his family before he goes away. There's a certain point at which he has the option to sell the methylamine and save his marriage and keep his kids safe, and he doesn't want to take it because it's not about his family, it's about him. We see this later too when Skylar shows him the huge pile of money that they have, and it's still not enough for him. He's not addicted to money or greed. He's addicted to the way it rewards his ego. He gets a rush from the grandiosity that it brings him. Making money by cooking crystal makes him feel competent, and it makes him feel powerful. His hard-on for providing for the family is only because he sees his family as a narcissistic extension of himself, but he still only really cares about himself and his image as a provider. Towards the end, when Walt Jr. refuses to take his money, he freaks out because it can't all have been for nothing. Finally realizes that the ends do not justify the means because he didn't even accomplish the ends. He finally realizes that it was for nothing. He really screwed up. But there is a silver lining to this, and that is that there is some hope for narcissists. They can gain self-awareness, take responsibility, and make an effort to change. Just like Walt found a way to save Jesse and provide for his family without taking any of the credit for it whatsoever, and how he admitted his own narcissism to Skylar, it shows that there can be a moment of insight where people like him realize the error in their ways and start to make amends. It's an incredibly painful moment for them, but it is possible. There's a common myth floating around the internet that NPD must be associated with a lack of insight or a lack of self-awareness. That's false. It could be way more rare to see a person with narcissism who is insightful, but it is absolutely possible and can lead to possible change. I mentioned in a recent video the rubber band theory of personality. You can stretch out the limits of your personality. You can change yourself somewhat. There are limits to how far you can go, but you can kind of have that flexibility. So lastly, what can we learn from the case of Walter White, aside from everything that I've said up until now? How to resist manipulation and exploitation? You call their bluff, you walk away no matter what they say to you, no matter how appetizing or threatening it might sound. You get them to admit that it's them who want you to do that thing and not you who wants to do that thing. And then once they admit that, you tell them to go do it themselves. Another lesson is don't make excuses or justifications for people. Pay attention to the red flags right away. See right through these types of people just like Mike does. And then keep your distance, because the moment they realize that you see through their bullshit, you will have a walking target on your back. Also pay attention to how people behave when life is going either really well or really poorly for them. How do they deal with stress? Do they take it out on others when life is throwing them curveball after curveball? Do they become grandiose and arrogant when things are going well? And be careful not to assume that you know someone's true colors until you do see them at their worst and at their best. It's easier to mask yourself when life is generally going stable and not at one of the extremes. Walt is also a lesson in the importance of integrating your shadow self. Like I mentioned, I do have a couple videos on this, and I think maybe I should make one on integrating your own personal shadow self, because that's not something I've touched on really. And lastly, if you yourself relate to any of the things that I mentioned, if you have a diagnosis of NPD or ASPD, the ending of Breaking Bad can be inspiring, because it shows that insight can help you take responsibility, make amends, and change for the better. It's too late for Walt, but it's not too late for you. And hopefully it doesn't take having to get to rock bottom to finally realize that and to change. Wow, this was a long video. I feel like I can hardly talk anymore. Since it was a long video, if you enjoyed it, it would really mean so much if you like this video or comment to interact with it. I would really appreciate it. Otherwise, I'll see you very soon and have a great week.